This time, we are going a little bit outside of my usual type, because rather than talk about one specific topic, I want to do a spread out approach about a constant thing that happens across, let's be honest, most media, but we're specifically going into it with Final Fantasy XIV. Not every idea people have about the world and story of 14 is correct. Sometimes we misread the facts. Sometimes we misremember things over the years the game's been around. Sometimes we're victim to just straight up misinformation, malicious or not. So today, we're going to be talking about a handful of misconceptions people have about things in 14's story and lore, why that idea's come up, and what the truth is. Stuff that couldn't be its own video, but it is worth saying to some degree. A couple warnings. First, these aren't all of the things people are wrong about within all of 14. That would be impossible. We're just going to go over some pretty common ones that come up in talking about its story or in role-playing circles where this stuff's often relevant and just gets brought up. Second of all, spoiler warning for specifically the latest patch, 7.2. There's a few other things you might count as spoilers in here, but you're not going to have an entire storyline ruined here outside of that one patch. With all of that, please give me a like, subscribe, comment, and all of that if you're into this, and let's get to it. We're opening with a very recent one, and the one that really inspired this whole video. The final boss of the Uiawata field station, the Turalvidral Luna Piatti, is Erenville's mom, somehow. The evidence in favor of this? That it's a rabbit, or probably more accurately a hare, whose fur is about the same color as Kakiwa's hair, and that it has side braids. Admittedly, weird touch to give it side braids. I don't blame people for noticing and latching onto that one. But is there counter evidence? Yes, and it's most of the evidence. Luna Piatti was the Turalvidral that Zorolja was dealing with right before Dawntrail. At that point, Kakiwa was accounted for off in Yasolani, so no, she can't be the Turalvidral. She can't be the person whose soul was put into the Turalvidral, because the final note in the field station dungeon says that the person lined up for that was male. She was also an endless in living memory, which requires her to be a person who died normally. So everything says that they can't possibly have any meaningful connection, let alone somehow being the same person. Plus, if the writers were going to do some sort of connection like this, they'd sound it like a goddamn foghorn and have the characters bring it up instantly, and they didn't. As for the side braids, Turalvidral, or auspices, do sometimes get what we'd recognize as human adornments like that. Valgaramanda has a crown, Siryu's got a full-on robe. So it's not impossible for Luna Piatti to just have braids. As for how this happened, this one's a very simple one to diagnose. People got excited before they got to thinking. They had a cool idea about 3 seconds after first seeing that boss, and ran with that instead of looking for proof. This is something you see a lot, just in general. People get their idea before seeing all the evidence, and read that evidence only in that lens, including throwing away all the evidence that says otherwise. We'll see a couple others like this today. So here's a classic. Y'shtola's ether sight is consuming her very life force, that she's in great danger forever, or maybe just about to die any minute now. This one stems from the cutscene with Matoya, where we learn that Y'shtola is blind, and the fact that honestly, sometimes the game is speaking on a different level than we expect when we first read it. Because, literally speaking, this is what Matoya says. That ether sight consumes Y'shtola's life force. But so does a lot of things. That's kind of how most magic works in 14's world. You consume your own ether, and then replenish it over time by doing things like eating. She's at higher risk than your average person because of it, sure, but it's not actually a problem. This scene more exists to show that Matoya, for all her mean and hardy exterior, genuinely cares for Y'shtola, that she is worried about her, and the tone and emphasis is more akin to an elderly relative worrying that the younger kid's been, smoking or riding a motorcycle. We read this line only as the words that were said, and we completely missed the tone and severity of it. The fact that this hasn't come up in 4 expansions, expansions that Y'shtola has been around for quite a bit of, that should reduce this as a warning siren. The writers don't play it this subtle, but I think that the scene where Y'shtola shares her ether with Zero also acts as a bit of an indirect calm down on it. Y'shtola's fine with expending and replenishing her own ether. This would have been a prime time to bring this up as an additional limitation, and they just didn't, because that's not what this is. This next one is stupid, and it only got stupider when I learned this origin. It has been a long-standing factoid within the community that black mages have an eye patch on a lot of their outfits because they replace that eye with a piece of materia. Sometimes you see people say that they used to do this, sometimes you see people saying that they still do this, and that inconsistency alone should probably tell you that we're dealing with something pretty tenuous in terms of evidence. First of all, according to the Encyclopedia Eorzea 2, the actual reason for the eye patch is partially to protect from void-sent gazers, and partially to increase focus by reducing peripheral vision, comparable to like the coverings on eyes that Olympic shooters use. As for where this came from, it stems from this one scene in the original Black Mage storyline, the creepy eye glow. Specifically, way back when this was added in 1.0, there was a small group of players who were pushing for this to be a cosmetic, because, you know, it would be kinda cool. And one of those people suggested as a story reasoning that they are replacing an eye with materia, because apparently some people think the barrier for this sort of thing is just that nobody's found a story reason yet, rather than because nobody's bothered to implement it, or because it's impossible. This one dumb post is the root of this entire thing. I'm not sure if he came up with it, or if he was just repeating something he'd already heard, but it's the root post. It's the oldest use of this claim. So thanks a lot, Jim. You fucked up Black Mage lore talk for a goddamn decade. That post was essentially lost just through Esoterica. I only have it because someone that I was talking to just incidentally found it one day. And the funny thing about some claims like this is that they only get more believable as evidence is lost. Without knowing that this started as someone's like what if forum post, this does sound like something barely resembling legit. It sounds like it could be lost Black Mage lore, and usually people ask for evidence against a claim instead of evidence for a claim in these cases. In a weirdly similar way, this next one is something that I've seen start multiple arguments, specifically because people take it as truth and then ask for counter-evidence. That when two different species in 14's world have a child, the child is the race of the mother with some physical details of their father. And I'm using species instead of race here because otherwise this part starts to sound pretty shifty when I read it off the script. This supposes that a Rogadine mother and a Mikote father would produce a Rogadine that'd maybe have a tail, for example. The origin of this one is unclear. We were lucky to find the origin of the Black Mage Materia Eye, but this one not so much. The strongest theory I've heard is that this was a role-playing group's house rule that broke containment long ago, but if that's true, finding that original is going to be extremely hard. In fairness, it took a long time to find concrete evidence against this one. Going briefly down the history of mixed species, people within the game, and sticking to permanent content because while I've heard there might be some examples in events, they're really hard to find evidence of, A Realm Reborn gave us Arenvold, Highlander mother, Garlean father, and sure enough, he lines up here. He is a Highlander with some ambiguous and possibly forcibly removed Garlean features. Heavensward gives us Hilda, Hjor mother, Elazin father, and she's a Hjor with pointy ears. Checks out. Stormblood sorta gives us the Ruby Prince, a figure only ever described in dialogue, and not actually called the Ruby Prince, that is a fan name. That dialogue does give us the lineage. Alra mother, Hjor father, and it tells us that their son had almost no scales. My gut says that probably fits the general thought, but my need for healthy skepticism says that this is still inconclusive. So this rule is holding pretty close, until Shadowbringers gives us Severa. Severa's backstory in Werlit places her with the same parentage as Arenvold, Hjor mother, Garlean father, but she seemed to come out of it as a Garlean, going by her third eye, and how she describes her training and proving herself. She never mentions that, like, she can do magic. The Garlean soldiers around her treat her otherwise, but, well, Garleans are racial purists, of course they would. Severa is not a loud piece of counter-evidence, but that's largely because to the developers, this probably isn't even a thing worth clarifying. They don't know that we came up with this rule. It might also be worth briefly covering a bit of a looser one here too. The fact that mixed species kids are rare. They're obviously rare, I can only think of 4 of them, and one of them doesn't even have a name. But people seem to naturally jump to this being a biological barrier, that the fertility rates with mixed species couples just happen to be low, when more likely it's a social one, that cross-species relationships are the rare part, as they're almost universally depicted as socially difficult at best and frowned upon at worst. I would say largely because a lot of the societies we know of in-game have very insular cultures and very specific views on gender in their society. Speaking of, going from a misconception possibly started by role players to one faced predominantly by them, this is one that's a little hard to quantify because it's both loosely evoked and loosely debunked. But trying to broadly make sense of it, the Noon of the Seeker of the Sun Makote tribes are often assumed to be an entirely sexual role. They're the breeding male of the tribe, that is their whole thing. They're like the designated weird Mormon guy of a Seeker tribe. Naturally, this sprouted from people who were excited about a very specific style of roleplay. And first of all, y'all are weird for even approaching that, but let's go over the facts. First of all, yes, the Seekers are a patriarchal tribe. And yes, the Noon are, very weirdly for the Encyclopedia Eorzea, stated to be a breeding male expected to put together a harem. Their words, specifically. What the hell, I was expecting the debunk to come earlier. As for the game itself, we've met 2 Noons over the course of the game. Uod in the Forgotten Springs in the Thanalan, and Miraz in the Fringes of Girabania. And out of these 2, it's the M tribe that gives us a much fuller view of the actual role of the Noon. Uod's just a Noon on top of his actual story reason to be around, while Miraz is around in the story as the Noon of the M tribe. And first of all, it's pretty clear in both cases that even though the tribe does seem to hold to these traditions, it's a lot more egalitarian than you might first assume. Monago's off doing good work with the resistance, the U tribe's got plenty of active women. But with the tribes themselves and their Noon, we learn that the role is a lot more, like, dryly political than the sexy fun time that people like to picture it as. Leading a whole tribe is really hard goddamn work. And it's work that Miraz kinda doesn't do, as Mahatoa is effectively the actual authority in the M tribe. There's also later suggestion that Noon is possibly also a title denoted more by owning and ruling the land more than anything. As Oriange once mentions that Graha would have had perfectly legitimate claim to the title thanks to the Crystarium, and he only just doesn't because I don't know, he's got a chronic need to look submissive and inoffensive. So, to summarize this debunk, yes, the Noon do have the sexy job, but it actually ends up being about 20% of their work, and the other 80% is, like, really boring. More of a character-focused one now. Let's quickly talk about everyone's most hated villain we haven't fought, and why we're wrong about that. No, the other one. Rowena is so deeply loathed by the fanbase that it's seeped into the writing itself, but at times that hatred delves deeper than the truth and gets uglier. This notion that Rowena is an absolute greedy monster, a horrible villain that we simply haven't gotten to yet. I can't even go into a full character study on Rowena if I wanted to. There is precious little info on her in terms of like concrete facts, but she is one of the few characters that's been around since 1.0. She started as a weapons merchant before moving into the tombstone trade that we know her for in A Realm Reborn. Officially, her trade is in antiquities. She's just collecting old shit in general, and is trading more immediately useful stuff in return. Now, is she a good person in doing this? On one hand, she is hardly winning Eorzea's Best Boss award going by her employees, and her relationship with Geralt, look, let's call that a mutual failure and move on. I don't want to get into that. On the other hand, she is a generous supporter of the orphanage in Idleshire. She's where all of Chloe's rewards come from. And she was one of the people Emeliance called on for good reason, even if she maybe proved ill-suited for that particular venture. So no, Rowena's not a good person by most metrics, but she's hardly heartless. I'd say she's not running a charity, but she clearly is on some level charitable, just not to us as players. We're customers, she's running a business. And we're hardly looking at an amoral weapons dealership thing. Out of all the big capitalists in the game, it's rather exceptional that Rowena's one of the few that has never once sold to an enemy of ours. Another misconception to knock out really quick, Rowena doesn't pay her employees in scrip. That idea comes from a misreading of Zloe Aliapo's story. Rowena pays her people normally, and Zloe is not an employee. She's just an extreme couponer that lives nearby. This one is something that started as a joke and grew out of hand. It was funny to curse Rowena for not giving us our cool new axe right away, and then for some people that turned into actually claiming that Rowena was cruel and evil for not giving us our cool new axe immediately. I suspect there's probably also an element of sexism here. There is a member of the Syndicate that's actually worse about all of the things we just talked about than Rowena, but we don't throw stones at him. But that's a bigger subject for another, less ridiculous day. Because next, we are going to talk about the Warrior of Light's ability to point a satellite cannon at a mosquito. This one is my least favorite in the entire video, so you'll have to forgive me getting a little brutal about it. The assertion that all limit breaks, the entire mechanic, every single one, is a Dynamis thing. The evidence for this one? There's one line in Elpis that vaguely hints at it. That one line actually uses the same phrasing used for the echo buff for solo duties rather than limit breaks, and I don't know if that same reference exists in all languages. We've also got the fact that the end singer, after the forced tank limit break in its fight, says Dynamis in a questioning tone. And I actually can confirm that one is an English thing, because in Japanese, that is a fuller line that is actually more vague, which makes sense because this is off at the arse end of the universe with Ultima Thule. Everything is being done with Dynamis, not just the limit break. She's just calling out that this thing is happening at all. This one really frustrates me because it's not just running on lack of evidence, it's running on anti-evidence. It's a claim you can only make if you are actively rejecting a much bigger pile of info. We actually have lore descriptions of every single limit break as of Endwalker in the Encyclopedia Eorzea, and most of them go into enough detail to actively infer a more specific source of power. It's usually etheric, and it is usually eminently quantifiable, neither of which are true for Dynamis. Some people suggest that this is because Dynamis didn't exist to be hinted at prior to Endwalker, but that doesn't work here either, because the limit break descriptions of the Shadowbringers and Endwalker jobs came in the Encyclopedia 3, after the introduction of Dynamis, and none of those descriptions ever hint at it. Not even Dancer, the job that somehow bumbled into being explicitly connected by story anyway. On top of all of that, the duty support NPCs in Catesis Hyperborea all have limit break access despite being ancients and therefore being unable to use it, and their dialogue when they do it suggests that they're not surprised by this. Well, Hithodias is surprised that things got so bad that you have to give him the responsibility of using a limit break, but that's a little different. In fact, Emmett Selk's line explicitly says that he is controlling ether. Every single scrap of evidence says that limit breaks aren't Dynamis. And yet people still go, oh nah, limit breaks are Dynamis. This cheeky wink nudge line, it says so if you squint your eyes so much you can't make out the text, and that counts more than all the other evidence you could have. This one, again, is people getting excited before they got to reading. It sounds cool that limit breaks are Dynamis, so they ignore everything that says otherwise, even though it is everything that says otherwise. And as someone who wants to do weird lore discussions, this one really frustrates me because there's some ability descriptions that genuinely might be rooted in Dynamis, as well as some genuinely interesting overarching theories about how limit breaks might actually work. But we don't get to talk about them until people stop trying to claim that red mages only get to blind their allies if they really feel like it. And how about another one where the counter evidence is just staring everyone in the face? There seems to be this constant thought that shards work on essentially Star Trek mirror universe logic, that there's always someone out there that looks exactly like a guy you know, and their role is exactly the same except in some way ironically twisted. This one is hard to find counter-evidence because counter-evidence mostly just wouldn't look like anything, so let's line up the evidence that we do have. Geralt and his reflections, Rowena and her reflections, the trolley boys and the train men, Cid and Shine Nuz. A bit of a slant example, but I see it. And there's been several times I've seen people damn near certain that nameless NPCs in Yulmore and Solution 9 are Zloe Eliapos shards, but I've never seen that, and if I take a guess on which ones they might mean and I'm wrong, people are gonna think I'm arguing this one in bad faith, so I'm not gonna take a guess. That's all of them, and you'll probably notice those are basically all jokes. The way the writers actually write shards isn't really interested in a mirror universe approach outside of those jokes. They're more interested in broader parallels, more societal levels, as well as showing us worlds so different they can't plausibly be on the same planet as, like, Uldar or Gridania. Their approach is reflected more by someone like Ardbert, who's reflective of the same type of character, but taken down a different road. In his case, plagued by failure rather than success. Oh, hey, he's another person who's got a source counterpart, so who's Ardbert's source counterpart again? Oh yeah, right. Going by Ardbert, it's actually highly likely that someone's shard equivalent looks nothing like them. All of this doesn't quite work for ancient counterparts. Those, the writers are more inclined to make more explicit and direct comparisons about for whatever reason, which might be adding to this assumption that they do this in other places that most other multiverse stories would. As for shards though, no, there isn't a version of Thancred on the 13th that's the same but a goth. Unless there's a joke to be made, in which case there might be a Thancred on the 13th that is the same but a goth. Another one in the role-playing realm, and one that often comes through in a sort of judgmental way, almost in a role-playing police version, that the Warrior of Light is the only person that can be, well, any given job you can think of, honestly. People blow this whistle in weird places. This one's kind of difficult to debunk due to its broadness, but to start with, every job we have access to in 14 is an established in-universe job and skill set that multiple people either currently or previously used. Role-playing is largely in a circle of if you can justify it, nobody will care except for a few killjoys, and if you find a stick in the mud, you can just ignore them and find your own people, but there just straight up isn't a job that would just be completely implausible for anyone other than the Warrior of Light. That said, if we are talking about the actual lore, there are differences in quantities. There are jobs that are going to be much less frequent than others, and that does include one job for which the Warrior of Light is the only known practitioner. I'm not going to keep everyone in suspense by going through this in rankings. Here is every job in the game right now, ranked by how rare they are. And yes, up in that top category is the only job for which this might be true: Scholar. This isn't a prohibition thing, it's just that Scholar job crystals are rare, and the fairies are temperamental. So the Warrior of Light is the only living person that we came across for which those variables have really lined up. And even then, there's some minor NPC chatter that's kind of suggested that this isn't a complete dead end for anyone else. Below that, we've got jobs that are rare, mostly because they have a super picky governing body. Basically, either this character is part of that body, or their story is probably going to be really exceptional for them to somehow be a white mage. After that, we've got the rare jobs that are rare because they're frankly way too goddamn dangerous. These jobs tend to get themselves killed either by being in dangerous situations or having extremely self-destructive abilities or temperaments, so there aren't many of them, but there is enough. Then we've got the pile of jobs that aren't common now, but it's mostly because of recent tragedy. The only thing stopping them from being common is a recent bottleneck. So while it's not weird that you will find multiple bards, all of those bards probably all know the same 3 guys. Then, we've got jobs that are exceptionally common in one in-universe country, but are exceptionally uncommon outside of it. A Hingan character makes total sense to be a samurai. You wouldn't ask any questions, they've got a bunch of them. But a Limson character being a samurai, there's a story going on there. And finally, this bottom row, these are just jobs that are being openly taught to whoever asks the right guy slash girl slash Moogle. They might not be common, but that's just because no one's asking. So in short, there's only really one job that might be exclusive to the Warrior of Light. There's plenty of others that you can't just have. There has to be a story there, but hey, this is in a role-playing and fanworks context. That's a positive, not a negative. And finally, a bit of a stand-in one, because this is just the most common permutation of an argument I see come up all over the place, that Hildebrand and its whole story just doesn't count, isn't canon, didn't happen, invalid evidence, not invited to the reunion. I can't even dignify this one with a good faith discussion of where this comes up, or a provider of the evidence in favor of it, because there just isn't any. People argue that Hildebrand doesn't count because they don't want Hildebrand to count. They want to talk about 14 as a big, serious, dramatic text, and its lore is deeply true and worthy of heavy, very serious person debate. They don't want to talk about this silly little slapstick storyline about a dipshit detective and his assistant with a concerning amount of demolitions equipment. I'm someone who openly doesn't like Hildebrand, but even I will say, that is just not enough of an argument. And when you see people try to strike other stories from the record, it's often similarly silly stories like the Namazu, or more outside the norm stuff like the Nier raid. Sometimes you see events come up here too. And here's the flat truth of this one, and the final truth of this video. Everything counts. Final Fantasy XIV has never had a story that isn't canon to itself, that isn't part of the game and the game's world. The question that is open is if the story matters. Hildebrand is unarguably canon, but are you missing something that's really all that important outside of that story if you don't do it? Not really, unless you really cared about Sildee before the Subterrane came out. In-universe, it's a ridiculous farce of a detective story. It's small scale. It doesn't touch anything. Events are much the same. What happened that one Starlight is canon, time bubble notwithstanding. But does what happened that year's Starlight really matter after that point? People try to argue that the Nier raids aren't canon, but does their canonicity even matter outside of the little corner of Calusia that they take place in? This remains true across a lot of stories. So many of them just don't really affect the greater world around them unless you really want them to. Because when I ask if they matter, I'm not just asking it about the game world, but about the player. Does Hildebrand matter to you? Does any story in this game that you don't much like actually matter to you? If not, why do you even care whether or not it's there? You can ignore it. You'll probably be happier for doing that, and you'll have more time to devote to something you do enjoy. So maybe, instead of saying that some part of the game just doesn't count in your eyes, you elevate a part of the game that you think does. It sucks when people aren't talking about the thing you like, so get them talking about that too. So, there we have it. A bunch of things people are wrong about. Maybe a few of them you were wrong about yourself. This was supposed to be a real quick video I could make while working on a bigger one, but then I got sick. Oh well. If you like this, please do all the YouTube things to encourage me. I'd love to do more broad focus, sort of like scattershot videos like this. You can also follow me on Blue Sky. It's a social network I don't hate being on. It's amazing. You could also join my Discord server, maybe donate to me on Ko-fi. The Discord server's been a great place, and a few things in this video were actually suggested there. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope to see you all again real soon. And remember, it's not wrong to be wrong, but it is wrong to stay wrong.